And we're live.
Hello and welcome to our latest Hershey Area All Things Diversity event. I'm Amy Ziegler with the Hershey Story Museum, Hershey Gardens, and Hershey Community Archives, and I am a member of our diversity group. Hershey Area All Things Diversity is a free series of programs to create awareness and promote acceptance and inclusion in our community. It is coordinated by representatives from Derry Township, Hershey Story Museum, Derry Township School District, Milton Hershey School, the Hershey Company, Penn State Milton S. Hershey Medical Center, Hershey Entertainment and Resorts, and the Hershey Trust Company. Tonight, we are pleased to have as our speaker, Joseph Robinson Jr., who will present Dr. King, A Man or a Myth. He will share information on the formative years of Dr. King and contrast his human personality with his mythic persona. At the end of the presentation, please put your questions in the chat on YouTube and we will share them with our speaker. And now I'm going to turn it over to another member of our committee, Susan Court.
Thanks very much, Amy. It's really great to be here tonight, and I'm really looking forward to our presentation. I hope everyone watching in is as well. And we have a really special treat tonight because in addition to our speaker, we have some representatives from Hershey High School and Milton Hershey School who are joining us tonight as part of our student panel. And at the end of our presentation, they're going to be asking some questions. We'll also be taking your questions from YouTube, so be sure to put your questions in the chat and Amy and I will be watching those. So before we get to our presentation, let's meet our student panel. Let's start out with our students from Milton Hershey School. Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to join you all today. My name is Arlene Samayo Rodas, and I'm a senior here at Milton Hershey School. And I've been at MHS since kindergarten, so a very long time. But I'm very interested in tonight's speech and conversation because growing up at Milton Hershey School, I've always been exposed to people from different cultures, backgrounds, and it's always something I've always seen as a luxury. Coming from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, I'm surrounded by the same people, like the Hispanic community, but being on MHS, I've been able to really get to know different people and get to hear different aspects. And now on SGA, student government, I serve as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Liaison, which is something that I work closely with Mrs. Abroko here and Ayomi to really create an inclusive environment for everyone and something that I'm very passionate about. So thank you.
Hi, my name's Ayomi Oladejo. I'm a junior at MHS, and I've been here since 7th grade. I'm also the DEI liaison, and I'm really excited to be a part of this today because I want to learn about what made MLK the great leader that he was.
Thanks to our Milton Hershey School students for joining us, and let's turn to Hershey High School. Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Bogret. I am so honored to be here tonight and truly honored to have been selected by my principal and the superintendent. In addition, I am a senior here at Hershey High School, and I've recently been accepted into Columbia University's class of 2026, where I'll be studying political science. And I really have been interested ever since I became a freshman at Hershey in the intersections between the political commentary of the past and how that affects the present, especially when it comes to government and making laws. And I do believe that MLK really had a direct impact on that and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I think that that's something that really needs to be mentioned in how that affects our life today. So I'm really just interested in seeing the political crossroads that we see between the past and the present. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Mofiala Dippo, and I'm as well a senior at Hershey High School. I'm very thankful for this honor of being able to be here. I'm a school board representative and class president at my school. And I wanted to be able to learn about how go further into the person that MLK was, just not the surface level stuff that we've already learned in school. I just wanted to learn more about him personally and his personality.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I guarantee you will all learn more tonight than you know coming into this. So, and I have to just say that I think we should stay in touch with all four of these students because in about 10 years, they can be leading this or being our speakers. They all sound like they're in great position to do that. So, and now we're going to turn to the point of the program where we're going to introduce our speaker tonight. As an author, speaker, and real-world leader, Joseph Robinson is passionate about helping people identify and cultivate vital characteristics of leadership. Retired after more than 2 decades with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, Joe serves as the executive director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Development Institute. The program is an initiative of the Harrisburg Interdenominational Ministers Conference to develop emerging community leaders. Joe also holds a BA from the University of Virginia. Joe, it is my distinct honor to introduce you as our speaker tonight, and we are so privileged that you accepted our invitation and can't wait to hear your presentation. So thank you, my friend.
Susan, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so honored to be here with this august panel of students. My goodness, you guys are some phenomenal individuals, and I'm so happy to share this panel with you tonight. And to all those who are listening, I'm also happy to be here and thank you for dialing in and tuning in. And thank you to All Things Hershey, All Things Diversity, for inviting me here tonight. I wore this particular old gold and black tie because Dr. King and I both are members of the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. It's the first African-American collegiate level fraternity in the nation, and founded at Cornell University in 1906. And so I thought I would wear the tie tonight to try and channel Dr. King, and maybe he'll send me some help here this evening. Tonight I wanted to just for a few moments, just examine the life of Dr. King. And I want to talk about the man and the myth. And I'm using as a subject a provocative question: why bother? Why bother? In 1929, down in Atlanta, a son was born to Reverend Michael King Sr., pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. After taking a trip to Germany and having become inspired by the German theologian Martin Luther, he changed his name and that of his 5-year-old son, Michael Jr., to Martin Luther King. Dr. M.L. King Jr., of course, grew to become the moral conscience of America in his day. Despite a wisdom and focus that belied his young age, Dr. King courageously defended the rights of all people and challenged the prevailing powers to see the U.S. Constitution in its brightest light and vigorously defend its universality. Tonight, here, and in 5 days, all of America will take time to remember and reflect on the life and legacy of this great patriot and citizen of the world. Of all the federal holidays, this holiday is the only one that requires us to do something for others. It is a day on, not a day off, a day of service, not sleeping. Yet, as we pause all over America to honor the memory of Dr. King, I'm compelled to ask the question, why bother? Despite Dr. King's undeniable alliance with organized labor and recognition of the role it played in creating a middle class, there is a large and growing segment of the population who, rather than reform unions that very well may have overreached in some instances, they seek to eradicate them entirely. And so for those who have a vitriolic disdain for organized labor, something Dr. King loved and united with, I have to ask you, why do you bother to celebrate the life of Dr. King? Despite this Baptist preacher's unflinching belief in the agape love exhibited by Jesus Christ, there are those who renounce the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and live instead by the mantra, every man and woman for him or herself. For those who view the notion of brotherly love as irrational, yet pause to observe the life and legacy of Dr. King, I have to ask you, why do you bother? Despite Dr. King's unwillingness to withstand even his inner circle, who urged him to distance himself from Bayard Rustin, an openly gay Black man who served as chief strategist and organizer for the 1963 March on Washington. There are those whose ideological beliefs trump their ability to see the inherent value of all human beings. Standing with their heels dug in deeply, they pause to honor the legacy of Dr. King while denying others their unalienable rights as tax-paying American citizens. And so to them, I have to ask you, why do you bother? Despite Dr. King's courageous and unpopular criticism of the war machine that diverted much needed funds from poverty programs, there are those whose actions today suggest that America's interests abroad supersede her interests at home. And so while heaping platitudes of praise upon the memory of Dr. King, they simultaneously rail against an increase to the minimum wage or affordable health care. And so the question begs to be asked of them, why do you bother? Dr. King insightfully declared that the struggle of the Negro was no different than the struggle for freedom and self-respect underway in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and even poor whites in America. In his I Have a Dream speech, he stated, many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. Despite his bedrock belief in an idyllic, beloved community, there are those who will dutifully observe the holiday while maintaining an inexplicable sense of superiority and privilege. And to them, we must ask, why bother? I would like to suggest 3 reasons that people of goodwill should bother to remember the life and legacy of Dr. King, and then take questions from our panelists. First, we bother because Dr. King bothered. Here was a man who graduated high school at 15, earned a bachelor's in sociology at 19, a bachelor of divinity at 22, and a PhD at 26. His father was pastor of a prominent church in Atlanta, and he could have pursued any profession of his choosing. And yet, when pressed into service, he responded to the call, reluctantly at first, but ultimately with his total being. I'll say more about this momentarily. Most of this is common knowledge and often repeated, lifting Dr. King to a mythical status, such that many believe it is not within themselves to emulate. But let's pause a moment and look at Dr. King, the man. Having just recited his academic credentials, we know he was a bright young man, well advanced beyond his years. But aside from being bright, he was not unlike most young men, and I dare say women, attending college away from home for the first time. For it was at the former Crozer Theological Seminary near Chester, Pennsylvania, that he became particularly fond of smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and shooting pool. It's reported he became a bit of a pool shark, attributable to many sessions that lasted until 3 a.m. Always possessed with a keen eye for the opposite sex, he even experienced his first interracial romance at Crozer. In 1950, this would likely never have happened in his home state of Georgia, at least not openly. But as we used to say here, you've got a friend in Pennsylvania. This romance was born out of an unusual love triangle involving himself and a professor with whom he played pool, who happened to only be 5 years older than him at the time and was also a Southerner from Virginia. And Betty. Betty was the daughter of a German immigrant cook at the school cafeteria. Now, although Betty was originally his friend, Professor Smith's girlfriend, King eventually wooed her away from his pool buddy, causing an irreparable rift in their friendship. I might add that King's interest in Betty was no passing fancy. King actually fell in love with Betty and desired to marry her. But after many consultations with friends and thinking of his future as a Black Baptist pastor in the South, he concluded that the pain this would cause his mother was more than he could bear. And so, while emotionally conflicted and irritated with the limits society had placed upon them, he made the pragmatic decision to end the relationship. After graduating from Crozer, he enrolled at Boston University, where he earned his PhD. In that environment, befitting an intellectual, he developed a habit of smoking a pipe and fiddling with it as he smoked. While attending Boston University, he sought to win the favor of a beautiful young student at the New England Conservatory of Music by the name of Coretta Scott. Gifted with a smooth tongue, he loved wooing the ladies with his lines. When he contacted Coretta, he began with, "You know, every Napoleon has his Waterloo, and I am like Napoleon. I'm at my Waterloo, and I'm on my knees." And to that, Coretta replied, "That's absurd. You don't even know me." She admitted that she was not initially impressed with his 5'7" stature either. But over time, the more he so eloquently spoke of his dreams and aspirations, the more he mesmerized her with what she called his intellectual jive, the taller he grew in her eyes. He wore tailored suits and drove a brand new Chevy, gifted to him by his father, Reverend King Sr., for graduating at the top of his class at Crozer. I might point out that Daddy King, as he was called, paid all his son's expenses while at Boston University. Interestingly, although King was raised in an Atlanta upper middle class family, he personally rebelled against the notion of acquiring personal wealth. Case in point, in 1964, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which consisted of a $54,000 cash award, Dr. King insisted that the award was validation of the movement and not him alone. So he divided the money equally among 6 organizations: the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which he led, the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the National Council of Negro Women, and the American Federation on Nonviolence. MLK III, Dr. King's son, I heard him speak in Harrisburg once, and he said that Reverend Hosea Williams, who was one of Dr. King's lieutenants, had remarked to him, he said, "Martin, the reason I was able to follow your father is because of 2 things. He overcame the love of money and the fear of dying." Dr. King was beaten, arrested, stabbed, run out of town, endured innumerable death threats, and was ultimately assassinated. But I hope you recall, as I do, his stirring and triumphant declaration that night before he was assassinated, when he said, "I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man, for mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And so we bother to remember the man because he bothered to put it all on the line, to challenge our country to breathe life into the declaration that all men are created equal. But as I alluded to earlier, he was initially reluctant at assuming the mantle being thrust upon him. It's often stated that leaders are made, not born. I agree. I also contend in my book that leaders do not always leap forward. Often they are pushed. Reverend Andrew Young, former U.S. ambassador and mayor of Atlanta, was a loyal King disciple, but he disclosed, he said, I'm convinced King never wanted to be a leader. I mean, everything he did, he was pushed into it. He further insisted that King got trapped into the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that coordinated the 381-day bus boycott. And we can talk more about that during the Q&A. You see, Dr. King pursued his PhD because of his aspirations to teach religion and philosophy at the college level. He envisioned himself pastoring a progressive church while engaging and challenging the thinking of aspiring leaders. But as John Lennon so insightfully stated, life is what happens to you while you are busy making other plans. Often criticized for his insistence on justice and equality, the last year of his life, he was embattled and attacked by friends and foes alike. Whenever you take an uncompromising stand against injustice in all its various forms, when you place principles over personal peril, you will be shunned, isolated, criticized, harassed, and threatened. He gave over 2,500 speeches in his lifetime, as many as 450 per year for several years. I said 450. That's more than one speech per day. Imagine the toll such a schedule had on his wife and their 4 young children. After being repudiated by others for denouncing the Vietnam War in 1967 and attempting to link the peace movement with the civil rights movement, he pivoted and tried to generate interest in a poor people's campaign. He met with 53 non-Negro minority group organizations to build a broader coalition. Unfortunately, due to a date with destiny in Memphis, Tennessee, in support of striking sanitation workers, the campaign never materialized. The rest we know is history. And so, number one, we bother to honor and celebrate Dr. King because he bothered for us. Secondly, we bother so that we never forget. So for many, the civil rights movement is regarded as ancient history. But the reality is that I was 8 years old when the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. When the venerable University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson, opened its doors in 1970 to women seeking an undergraduate degree, I was 13. When February became National Black History Month in 1976, I was 18 years old and graduating from Harrisburg High School. If it happened during my lifetime and many of yours, then it can't be ancient history. I still remember watching with pride Johnny Carson with his special guest, the late General Daniel Chappie James Jr., the first Black four-star general in American military history, who was named commander of NORAD. General James said at that time that he was looking forward to the day that achievements such as his would be noteworthy and not newsworthy. In 2016, Emmanuel J. Coleman III, a young Black cadet, became West Point's first captain and class president, placing him among the ranks of only 7 other cadets in Academy history to hold both of these titles, including General John J. Pershing, no less. A year later, in 2017, Simone Askew became the first Black woman to hold the position of first captain and leader of the West Point Academy Corps. A year after that, in 2018, Lieutenant General Darrell A. Williams, himself a 1983 West Point graduate, returned 35 years later to become the first Black superintendent of the West Point Academy in its 222-year history. But these gains and many countless others did not come without great sacrifice of life. And those sacrifices also are not ancient history. For when 3 young men, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, were killed in 1964 in Mississippi trying to register Blacks to vote, I was 7 years old. And when Dr. King was killed in 1968, I was 11 years old. So it's not ancient history. We bother to honor the legacy of Dr. King so that amidst all the electronic and social media distractions of our day, we never forget the sacrifices that were made by so many on our behalf. We must not forget the message of Dr. King. It was more than a dream that his children would one day be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. Rather, he spoke of peace and justice and love. He said, "We have never had peace in the South. We have had a negative peace, which is merely the absence of tension. We've had a negative peace in which the Negro patiently accepted his situation and his plight. True peace is not merely the absence of some negative force of tension. It is the presence of a positive force, of the presence of justice and brotherhood." To those who question his use of nonviolent protests to defy the law with peaceful marches and demonstrations, he declared, "There are just laws and there are unjust laws. A just law squares with a moral law, with what is right. So any law that uplifts human personality is a just law. Conversely, any law that does not square with the moral law of the universe, with the law of God, is an unjust law. And so any law that degrades the human personality is an unjust law. Therefore, he believed and went on to say that any individual who disobeys a law whose conscience tells him it is an unjust law, and he is willing to accept the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, that person is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for law. Incidentally, these were the words written to his clergyman detractors in his famous letter from Birmingham jail, outlining his philosophy and his 4 basic steps for successful nonviolent direct action. What are those steps? Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. Number 2, negotiation. Number 3, self-purification. And then number 4, direct action. He explained that the 4th step, that is the marches, the demonstrations, etc., seek to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. In today's divisive climate, with an ever-increasing resurgence of hate groups, it's easy to understand why today's young activists take to the street to march and protest about a variety of systemic inequities. I'm elated to see the young men and women full of vim and vitality, passion and persistence rise up and make their voices heard. It has always been the young generation who pushed the envelope to bring about change, and so we celebrate them. However, we who are either students of history or have lived through history must redirect our young people and acquaint them with Dr. King's 4 steps. For a protest to be impactful, there must be an identified antagonist and articulated demands put to that antagonist for adoption. We can't become enamored by the ability to draw a crowd and talk loud. For Dr. King, direct action protest was the last resort when all attempts at negotiation had failed. The direct action was taken for the sole purpose of driving the antagonist back to the negotiation table. But what is also overlooked among our current protests is step 3, self-purification. This is the step whereby the marchers were trained in the precepts of nonviolence. There they asked themselves, can I withstand an unprovoked blow or insult without retaliation? Am I prepared to go to jail if necessary for this cause? These steps are not applicable only to those fighting injustice. These steps would have served those well who besieged the Capitol on January the 6th. One of them is Virginia Spence, recklessly and without forethought, forced her way into the Capitol. Her attorney weakly argued that she ate up media coverage of protests that erupted across the country in the summer of 2020 after Officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. He said, after months of watching our major cities burn, many people became convinced that vocal displays of outrage in the form of protesting was the only way to make their voices heard. I submit, however, that had they observed Dr. King's 4 steps, their actions would have been as peaceful as the revisionists have attempted to portray them. During the final year of his life, Dr. King issued prophetic words of warning to a country he loved dearly. He said, America, I don't plan to let you rest until the day comes when all God's children are respected and every man will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. America, I don't plan to let you rest until seats from every state house are occupied by men who will do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before their God. America, I don't plan to let you rest until you believe what you have read in your Bible, that out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. So not only do we bother because Dr. King bothered, and not only so that we never forget, but finally we bother because history repeats itself. President Harry S. Truman said, the only thing new in this world is the history you don't know. We only need look back at recent elections to recall the legislative tinkering that has been done by many state legislators to require voters to secure a new government-mandated form of photo ID in order to exercise a right they had enjoyed for years. To those old enough to remember, this unfunded requirement is akin to the long outlawed poll tax. The fact that elementary school performance is used as a forecaster of the prison growth rate, that young Black men are more likely to be stopped and frisked than whites, Latinos, or Asians, 5 times more likely to be killed. Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Dante Wright, and Ahmaud Arbery are 21st century examples. That Blacks who are 13% of the US population, but only 38% of the prison population, largely due to nonviolent drug-related offenses. All of these are reasons we must bother to remember Dr. King and the cyclical nature of history. Frederick Douglass observed that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And so as I close, I say unto you that we must bother. When our time here is ended, we all want to go to our Maker with a clear conscience. In the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson, played by the late Chadwick Boseman, Branch Rickey, who was played by Harrison Ford, said to the Phillies general manager, Herb Pennock, who threatened to boycott the game if the Dodgers insisted on playing Robinson. He said, Herb, someday you're going to meet God. And when he inquires as to why you didn't take the field against Robinson in Philadelphia, and you answer because he was a Negro, it may not be a sufficient reply. None of us will live forever, and how you live your life makes all the difference in the kind of world you will leave behind. How sad it would be to live your life and no one take note of your existence or your expiration. As already demonstrated, Dr. King was no different than you or I. He had the same insecurities, the same shortcomings, the same aspirations. He did no more than any of us can do if we are willing to pay the price. Sirius XM radio talk show host Joe Madison, known as the Black Eagle, says, the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. My friends, if we're going to change the divisive rhetoric and discourse populating our conference rooms and our kitchen tables, if we are ever going to bring to fruition that beloved community that Dr. King envisioned, then we must take a stand against injustice and racism, one conversation, one interaction, one relationship at a time. Whether it's the coal miner, the school teacher, the factory worker, the displaced white collar manager, the Me Too movement, or Black or Blue Lives Matter, we must learn from the example Dr. King provided in 13 tumultuous years of a very short 39 years of living. Dr. King's life was embodied by the song recorded by the late, great Mahalia Jackson, which said, if I can help somebody as I travel along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody that he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. For the benefit of my friend Michael Sand, who may be listening, I close with this story about a mousetrap. The story is told that a farmer one day decided to put out a mousetrap for this mouse that was in the house. And when the mouse saw the mousetrap being set, he ran out into the barnyard and he told the chickens, he said, there's a mousetrap in the house. There's a mousetrap in the house. And the chicken cackled and walked away. So he ran over to the hog, the pig, and said, hey, there's a mousetrap in the house. The hog just grunted and went on about his business. So then he ran to the cow and said, there's a mousetrap in the house. There's a mousetrap in the house. And the cow just mooed and went on about his business. Well, later on that night, the mouse, having gone back into the house to await his unknown fate, went back into the house. Later that night, there was a loud snap. The lady of the house came down to empty the trap, presuming she had caught the mouse. Unbeknownst to her, a snake had got entangled in that trap. When she reached for the trap, the snake bit her. Well, the woman took ill and got feverish. And we all know that when you have a fever, one of the best things for it is a nice hot bowl of chicken soup. So he went out and killed that same chicken to make some hot soup for this feverish farm wife. Well, that went on for about 2 weeks, and people kept coming by inquiring about her. And so the farmer felt some obligation to provide and offer them something to eat. So he went out and butchered that hog so that the people visiting his wife might have something to eat. Well, after about 3 months, she finally recovered. And in celebration of her recovery, he said, I'm going to throw a party. I'm going to throw a feast. And he went out and killed that same cow that he might feed everybody who came around to celebrate his wife's recovery. Meanwhile, the mouse, who was observing all of this, said to himself, my, how all of this could have turned out so differently if they had only seen my problem as their problem too. The day after Christmas, we lost Bishop Desmond Tutu, and he said it this way: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And finally, Dr. King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. This, my friends, is why we must bother. Thank you.
Joe, thank you. Thank you for bothering to come talk to us, because your words were inspirational and motivational. And I know Amy and I have questions, and we want to encourage everyone watching live tonight to put their questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. But first, we're going to turn to our student panel. You mentioned that while we're all in our middle age here trying to affect change, that the burden is on our youth. So we're going to turn to them to ask the questions tonight. So I'll just invite any of our students from Milton Hershey School and Hershey High School. When you have a question, just go ahead and open up your mic and ask your question of Joe.
I have a question to start off, if that's okay.
Certainly.
So do you feel like the similar problem of spending more attention and resources to the military and police rather than focusing on like our at-home concerns of poverty and homelessness is occurring today in the wake of far-right political leadership? And if so, how do you feel like the nation can recover?
Well, this is an excellent question, Elizabeth. Excellent. And this is why we said at the outset, history repeats itself. There's nothing new. The same issue Dr. King railed about concerning the Vietnam War, the same issue is still going. We're still taking funds in the name of our external interests concerning about how we're able to defend ourselves abroad. You know, we put all these things in place at the expense of needs right here within our country. There are a lot of people who are hurting in this country, and we put money in a lot of places. And I think that we have a responsibility to continue to work with our elected officials, as well as identify elected officials who view the same perspective that we have. And so in this country, the way you get things done is through our political process. So we have a responsibility to be engaged citizenry. We have a responsibility to understand the issues and to understand people's platform, and not just continue to return people to office because they've always been there. But we need to take a critical analysis of their positions and make sure that if, in fact, the times are shifting, to make sure they're shifting with them as well. So excellent question, Elizabeth.
I have a question.
Yes, Mofi.
So MLK got a lot of hate and he was arrested, and obviously it was very tough on him. And I was just wondering, what do you think the catalyst or like the spark that made him keep going was?
Oh, what made him keep going? Yeah. As I said, initially Dr. King was reluctant to serve because he had his own vision for his life, you know? And then when he found himself in the midst of this juggernaut, he began to embrace it. And what made him continue on was we cannot ever forget the fact that Dr. King, aside from a civil rights leader, he was first and foremost a Baptist preacher. And so what motivated him and compelled him was his abiding faith in the God of the universe. As he often said, he quoted that the arc of the universe, the moral arc of the universe, bends toward justice. And so he believed that. And so that's what motivated him to keep pressing on. If you believe, I mean, that was his philosophy. He believed that there is a God who is in charge of this world, and he believed that God would frown upon injustice, and he just could not believe that that God would just consistently turn his back on injustice, and he felt that he had become a vessel to help bring about that change, or at least raise awareness. And so that's what kept propelling. It was his abiding faith in the one who had called him into this particular task, and I think that's what motivated him. He talks about a crisis he had one night. He had had so many threats, and he was sitting at his kitchen table, and he talks about that. And you may have read about that when you read about Dr. King. And he was sitting there at his table, and he was really going through it and having some doubts. And at that moment, he said something came over him sitting at that table as he was agonizing over this. Something came over him, and it brought him a sense of peace and calm to let him know that he was on the right track, and whatever happened. That's why he could say that night when he was killed, "I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory." So Mofi, that we can never forget and try and separate Dr. King's faith and his religious beliefs from his community activism. That is what drove him. That was his motivator. The question was asked once of Wyatt T. Walker, who was one of his associates, and at one point was president of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and he was asked, Wyatt, Dr. Walker, Dr. King was so well read, and who of all the authors that he read, who do you think influenced him the most? And Wyatt T. Walker said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's who influenced Dr. King. So that was the motivation, Mofi.
I just wanted to ask a question quickly.
You don't have to answer quickly.
As you alluded to earlier, in your discussion about Dr. King's life, with the pivotal role that current young activists play in our continued fight for social equality, what advice do you believe Dr. King would give to these young activists who are seeking to carry on a movement that was molded by his image?
I believe Dr. King would be encouraged by the level of interest in our young people in bringing about change. I mean, he always welcomed that. But in his day, he went through that same tug and pull with the young people. Back then, you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and these were younger people that were like students, 18, 19. And by that time, Dr. King was this ripe old man of 29, 30, you know what I mean? So these young kids thought he wasn't moving fast enough, and so he always had that tension. But he always welcomed and encouraged their involvement and participation. But what Dr. King would say, I believe, is what I attempted to say tonight, is there is a process that we need to recall if we're going to have effective demonstration. That was those 4 steps. We've got to, and a lot of times what we do, we just jump out and start protesting, but we haven't done the hard work of, first of all, documenting the injustice that has occurred, finding out who is responsible for it, and then going to that person to make your request known, the things that you're concerned about. And then you do that, and then if you get a sense that you're hitting a brick wall, then that's when you have to say, well, this is going to lead us to get their attention. We're going to have to do some direct action protesting. That's when you make that decision. But then he also says, before you go out and make that direct action, you got to do some self-introspection, some self-purification, and say, now, am I ready? See, a lot of people will jump out there and protest a situation. I keep harkening back even to the January 6th. A lot of those people, if they really believed if they really believed that what they were doing were right, then they should have been willing to accept the consequences. But what you hear now is crying foul. I didn't do that. I didn't know it was, all kind of excuses. But Dr. King says, when you willingly accept consequences for what your moral conscience tells you, he said, then you're exhibiting the right attitude and respect for law. So I would say that's the thing is the young people, is to drive them back to the notion that there is an organized approach to protesting, and I don't think we employ that enough. And so it's my kind of personal mission to keep lifting up Dr. King's strategy so that people understand that there is a way to do this and to do it even more effectively. So that's what I would say, sir.
Thank you.
Another question that I have is, what do you think is the characteristic that is most attributable to King's prevailing legacy, and why?
The characteristic. I think that he was not only was, well, I'll say two attributes: his humility and his courageousness. It takes courage, or it takes humility. First of all, I mean, he could go into a situation. He could go into a town and talk to people. He just had a winning personality with people. Loved to laugh, loved to tell jokes, loved to shoot pool. You heard me say he didn't mind drinking beer. Or when you could go to the Harry Belafonte's house, they said he would, their house, he would always drink a Harvey's Bristol Cream, and he'd go there and every time, and he'd say, hey, who's been drinking out of my bottle? Every time he'd go back to visit, that was their standing joke. So he was a very personable person. And so which speaks to his humility, because we want to elevate him on this pedestal and think that he was, that perhaps he thought he was all that, but he didn't. He had a humble spirit. So it was his humility and his courage, his courageousness. I mean, to deal with what he had to deal with, the many death threats on his life, and yet still press forward, as I said to Mofi, because he was driven by this belief that the God of the universe saw his cause as just. I just think those are two things we can't overlook: his humility and his courageousness to be uncompromising wherever he saw injustice. And that's the one thing I talk about in the book. Is the sixth imperative in my book called 7 Leadership Imperatives, is the notion of being uncompromising. You have to, to be an effective leader, you've got to be uncompromising where justice is concerned. When you see it, you've got to, injustice where it raises its head, you've got to be willing to speak to it and be willing to accept the consequences. That's what I'm saying. The folks January 6th, now they're all crying foul. I mean, if that's what you really believe, then you accept the consequences of what you believe, if it's a genuine belief. And so, to be uncompromising, you have to be willing to say, I'm going to withstand this. And even if it means some personal damage to me, it's all right, because that's how much I believe in this particular cause. And so that's why I would say the two attributes for me, Arlene, is his humility and his courageousness.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.
And of course, it didn't help that he was just so well read and so articulate and so intelligent, because he was able to speak to people, from kings to people on the street. He could just be all things to all people because of his intellect. So what does that say to us? That says to us too that we've got to do our homework. So it ain't just about talking loud and drawing a crowd. You've got to know what you're talking about as well. And he came well versed and well prepared. You all asked some outstanding questions. Just want you to know that, just for the record. Our future is in good hands with you all.
Well, I'll tell you what, if any of our students think of anything else they want to ask, feel free to jump in. And we want to invite, of course, everyone who's watching live to put questions in the YouTube chat. Joe, you've gotten some great comments. Everyone really feeling empowered and motivated by your speech tonight. So thank you for that. Amy, maybe you and I could ask a couple while the students are giving some thought to see if there's anything else they want to ask this evening of Joe before we wrap up. But Joe, in preparation for Monday and kind of rereading some of Martin Luther King's words, and I'm reflecting back to my time as a youth. Now I was very small. I was 4 when he was shot. But I think back to how much change has happened in my lifetime. But I also stop at the same time and think how much change hasn't happened in my lifetime.
Right.
And I wonder, what do you think Martin Luther King would think if he was still alive today, looking at the progress, but looking at so much more that has to happen? What do you think he would think?
I think he would be very disturbed by what we perceive as an attempt to restrict voter access. I think that would disturb him greatly because of all the blood that was shed by people who literally died. I mean, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner there in Mississippi trying to register Black voters in Mississippi, brutally killed, for that, making that sacrifice. Those young men coming down to Mississippi, all the freedom riders. When you look at all of the people who sacrificed for this very cause, he would be very disturbed to see that is still an issue on the table. And so I think he would continue to rail against that. I think he would also be concerned with some of these more global issues affecting our home lives, our communities, where there's poverty. I mean, that was his thing when he got killed. He was pivoting to the Poor People's Campaign. Poverty was something that he was hoping to raise attention to. Want to bring attention to this notion that this gap between the have and the have-nots was just so broad and almost immoral. It was so broad, and he just couldn't fathom, and many of us can't either, how a nation so prosperous, a nation that has more billionaires in this country than any other country in the world, how there can still be so much poverty. So I'm sure he would still continue to deal with the poverty issue and the income gap inequality, and certainly continue to rail against attempts to keep people from the voting process, because again, so many people died for that very issue, and I think that would still be uppermost on his mind.
I have more of a comment than a question, but
Sure.
I think what I love, first of all, you're a great speaker, so thank you.
Thank you.
I really liked hearing you talk about the fact that he was really reluctant to do this at first, and he was a flawed human being, and I think that this myth of him being perfect, we kind of expect perfection from our leaders and are very, very quick to dismiss or cancel people when they do something wrong. I think it's refreshing to hear about him being a flawed human, because I think it sort of should encourage us to think that we are all that way too, and it's not something that should stop us from doing something that could help bring about some great change.
Yeah, when you elevate people to such a level, then you start to feel like, well, I can never do that. People look at Mother Teresa, and the sacrifice she made in Calcutta, India, for the indigent and poor. People, I can never be Mother Teresa. Well, why couldn't you? All it takes, as Joe Madison says, the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. That's all it takes. You just have a commitment to doing it. It's within all of us if we're willing to make that sacrifice. So yes, you're right. He definitely had his challenges, but we can't, and he didn't allow that to stop him. But yeah, he was very reluctant to get engaged initially. And when Andrew Young said he got trapped into the bus boycott, what happened? They had organized. They called an emergency meeting to talk about the bus boycott, etc. And he was a little bit late getting to the meeting, and he was a new preacher in town, the new pastor. And when he walked into the meeting, there were a couple people in the room, a couple preachers who kind of competed against each other, if you will, and neither of them wanted to see the other one have any prominence. So when King walked in the room, one of them said, "I nominate Dr. King to lead this West boycott." And everybody, "That's right, I agree," because he was a neutral guy. He was young, he was new, and so that's why Andrew Young says he was trapped into the Montgomery bus boycott. So all this stuff, I can imagine what he said when he got home to Coretta and said, "Coretta, you can imagine what happened tonight when I went to that meeting." And so here he was now charged with leading a movement. And that's what happens to all of us. As I said, leaders don't leap for it, leaders are pushed forward.
We have some questions from YouTube, so I was going to ask one of those. Dr. King spoke often in terms of religious terminology and iconography, but how does that struggle translate to today when a growing proportion of the population is not religiously affiliated?
Yeah, it makes it challenging. It makes it more challenging, but you know, it has not changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And his words are immutable, and we just have to stand on that. Even in the midst, even as the circumstances around us change, we have. If you look back into the history of time, even in the biblical days, in the days of the Apostle Paul, and some of the things he had to encounter in Athens and Greece, and I mean over in Athens, and all of the different gods that were being worshipped in the pantheons and all, and yet he still had to lay out his message and talk and state his perspective and his view. So yes, those religious comments today, those religious philosophies or underpinnings today may ring hollow in the ears of some, but we have to stand firm and continue to espouse them. And Dr. King would have, and he did in his day. Again, as I said, don't forget, he was a gospel preacher, and everything he did was predicated on the belief that the arc of the moral universe was long, but it bends toward justice. You know, and so that's what I would say to those who say, "Yeah, I don't disagree, but you are a person of faith. You have a responsibility to stay the course and to keep sounding that drum, if you will, beating that drum and that clarion call to what you believe." That's what I believe, and I think Dr. King we would not have seen him wavering in the changing times either.
Joe, we have another question from one of our YouTube viewers who wondered what Dr. King would think and how would he approach the call for defunding the police?
That issue, I think we have to look at that. I've thought about defunding the police. That I always say that no matter what terms we come up with sometimes in life, sometimes they can misrepresent what we're really trying to convey. And so even when you say defund, that has taken on a connotation for many to presume that there's this desire to strip our police forces as we know it of all of their funding. And that's not the intent. And so to defund, even though we know the intent is basically to say, let's redirect some of the funding to some preventative measures. I think that's the intent of it, but the words themselves connote something else, and that's a challenge we have to deal with. But I don't think Dr. King would be in favor of defunding the police, but he would always and did decry the militarization of the police. I mean, don't forget that was Bull Connor and those boys with the dogs and the water hoses and all that. So he would never, he would always look for reform. He would still be preaching reform in our police departments, but I don't know if he would have chosen the term defund because it sends the wrong signal that somehow or another we're trying to take away all of the funding, and that's not the intent. But he definitely would still stay the course and say we've got to deal with this demilitarization of the police force. Now, somebody once said Dr. King about that. Well, Dr. King, you know you can't legislate people to love you and make laws to make them love. He said, well, that's true. He said, that's true. He said, but you can, but if that law can stop them from hitting me over my head, he said, I think that's okay. You know, so.
So his words are still so incredibly relevant today, so many years later, and You know, you read them and you think, on one hand, you know, isn't this amazing? It's still so relevant and it resonates so much. And on the other hand, you think, isn't it a shame that these words still have to mean something? But
Right.
I'm going to read a section that I'm sure you know this speech inside now, but this particular section from the I Have a Dream speech just sort of strikes me. And I just want to get your take on this particular section and its relevance today.
All right.
Now is the time to make real promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice. Hang on, I'm sorry, in the middle of that, I just lost the script. To the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children.
Yeah, such descriptive language that he used, you know, and the contrasting, you know, sand and the solid rock. I mean, just his command of the language was just so profound, and the way he could, as we say in the Baptist church, we say he could paint the picture, you know, and he was so profound to do it. And it is, now was the time then, and now is still the time for us to keep fighting these same issues to bring about justice. His dream was to have this, what he called the beloved community, where he believed that we're finally, we would all see ourselves as brothers, you know, brothers and sisters. And so that's why he argued then that now is the time, and the time is still now, but we're still struggling with that. And that's, to your point, Susan, as poignant as those words were then, the fact that it didn't take root and we're still fighting that same bias, that same prejudice, that same discord with one another is disheartening. But, you know, we have to stay the course regardless. You know, sometimes I talk about this in the book. The seventh imperative talks about be encouraged. You have to do your part to move the ball. Sometimes you will see the progress and sometimes you won't. Dr. King said, I may not get there with you, right? He said, but I believe tonight that we will make it to the promised land. Remember, he said that when he got killed. So you're not going to always see the fruits of your labor. You need only look at some school teachers. Some school teachers labor for 20 and 30 years in school, and every now and then they'll be rewarded by some student who will return back and say, Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have been this. And that there they had an opportunity to finally see the fruits of their labor. But all the while they were slogging through and preparing lesson plans and working with those kids, you know, just doing their part to make a difference in the lives of those kids. And that's all any of us can do. And so when we say be encouraged, it's this notion of be encouraged that you're on the right path, that you're making your contribution. It doesn't matter what the forces of evil say or do. And no matter how cyclical this challenge is, at this moment, I am here. What can I do today, you know, to do my part? And we just keep on passing that baton. We just keep on working despite the things around us. So yeah, it's frustrating, but the worst thing you can do is give up. You know, all of us have to fight it in our respective places. As I said, one conversation, one interaction at a time.
Before we have you wrap up, we have one more question that Amy's going to share from YouTube, and then we'll go back to our students just to see if they have any final questions, and then we'll give you a minute to wrap up, Joe.
Okay.
Amy?
Okay, last YouTube question. What advice would Dr. King give to people who remain silent when they see racism taking place, but yet claim they do not share those same beliefs?
Lord have mercy. What did Bishop Tutu say? It says when you choose silence in the face of oppression, in the face of injustice, you have at that moment sided with the oppressor. And Dr. King would say the same thing. What did I say at the conclusion? He said, at the end, it's not our friends that we'll recall, but it's our enemies that we'll recall, but it's the silence of our friends. And so Dr. King definitely would continue to take us all to task. We have a responsibility we have responsibility. What John Lewis said, when you see something, say something, get into good trouble. And that's what this is all about. That's the only way this is going to change, that we all have to become allies to one another. You know, what was it, Gandhi that years ago? Gandhi said, "Be the change that you want to see." Right. So we have a responsibility to speak up. And again, like Dr. King, it takes courage to speak up, and doesn't mean, but we have to do it, and it might make us personally uncomfortable and put us at odds with some people around us. But you've got to put principle over personal peril. And that's what Dr. King would tell us to do.
Absolutely. Let's turn to our students. If any of them have any final questions for you, we'll just open up the floor and let them ask.
Yeah, I have one more question.
All right.
Just regarding Dr. King's influence, I mean, emphasis obviously on nonviolence. Do you
Yes.
believe that this was the most effective way to impart change into society, especially because during the same time or around the same era, we had Malcolm X and like the Black Panther Party and other Black nationalists who obviously had different ways of pursuing change?
Right. That's right. That's right. Excellent question. Obviously, we know Dr. King was a proponent of nonviolence, even in the midst of the rhetoric that was being espoused by others, like, as you say, the Black Panthers or Malcolm X. But what we need to recognize too, that early King and early Malcolm were different than later King and later Malcolm. They both, King started out here saying everybody's God loves everybody, and everybody wants to do the right thing. And Malcolm started out over here saying, people are demons and people can't be trusted, and they don't mean us any good. We need to separate from them. But then over time, Malcolm, when he had his own conversion, not conversion to Islam, but his own experience, having gone to Mecca and observed Muslims who were whiter than white folks on the street that he was crying, he realized that they're not devils. Everybody isn't a devil. And so Malcolm started moving this way. King, on the other hand, he had some horrible times out there in Cicero in Chicago, and they ran him out of there. And so he began to say that, man, there are some folks who are just hateful. And so he started moving this way. So both of them were getting closer to finding some ways to work together, and had begun to work together. Malcolm believed that his strident approach is what caused some people to listen to Dr. King, because he kind of set it up as a good cop, bad cop. You either listen to me and my rhetoric, or you all pay attention to King, and so they actually began to become they began to develop some synergy between the two of them. So I think Dr. King obviously believed that nonviolence is the way, and I think that there are those who would say, as Malcolm had said, about defending yourself, that you have to defend yourself from someone. But again, I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that Dr. King, as a gospel preacher, believed what the Bible says. And when it talks about blessing those who despitefully use you and turning the other cheek and those kinds of things, I mean, he believes that. That was his fundamental Mofi underpinning. He believed that. And so if that's your core belief, you have no choice but to remain true to it, if that's your core belief. And that's where he was. So yes, I believe that he espoused and preached what he believed was the most effective way. Because remember, with all of his protests, his objective was never to gloat and dehumanize or embarrass or insult an oppressor. He was always trying to win their support by showing them unconditional love. And so even after they successfully accomplished the Montgomery bus boycott, he admonishes people about gloating. You're going to still be respectful when we go on the buses. We're not going to be spiteful and rub it in people's nose and say, yeah, I'm riding the bus now, ain't I? All that kind of stuff, He wanted them to always be respectful because the intent is never to separate, but to pull people together. And that was his approach. So from his perspective, the nonviolence was the way to go because that would have more opportunity to pull people in after you achieved a victory, after you had pricked their moral conscience and had caused them to change their way of thinking. Then you could pull them into the fold. And so that's why he believed in the nonviolent approach.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Any other questions from our student panel representatives tonight?
Yes, I have another question.
Yes.
Well, Martin Luther King was definitely a man full of wisdom, full of
Mhm.
words, and a lot of motivational like speeches and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
my question is, which of King's leadership qualities or pieces of advice would most benefit the youth of America and young advocates and activists today?
Mm. Well, that's an interesting question. You mind if I relay that question to you all as young people to tell me what have you heard about King, or what impact has King had on you as young people, and what have you gleaned from the life of Dr. King as you've come to know it? So I'm going to return that question back to you all. So have at it. I can't. Go ahead. Who's that? Mofi?
Yeah, it's Mofi. I think that something that I've learned from Dr. King is especially standing up for what is like right, what we believe in, no matter the hate or no matter how many people are going to be talking against us or talking behind our backs. I think that's just a very important lesson that he taught, especially giving the speeches that he gives, teaching the young generation to like rise above the standards and what's set before us.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Excellent. Someone else?
Personally, for me, one of well, I have three things. So I think the
Oh,
main three things that I would say is building community, collaboration, and passion. Because I think
okay.
these three things are like the drives that really help propel people to speak up about what they believe in and to really connect with other individuals. And I think a lot of protesting and a lot of making change is coming together. And without having the passion to do that, all of it's meaningless. So, with passion that drives people to really make change and to really, um, I guess, I don't know, like, I just think without passion, a lot of things wouldn't be where they are today. And I think Martin Luther King was definitely a man full of passion and full of
Mhm.
empathy, and he always had the desire to collaborate and to build community. And without those three things, I don't know. Well, I'm sure, like, I don't know how successful the campaign would have been, and if he didn't instill those three things into his own life.
Mm. Okay. Okay. All right. Very insightful. Uh, Naomi or Elizabeth?
Yeah, for me, I believe Dr. King's tranquility in the midst of
Mm.
unwavering persecution was
Good
something
word.
that I believe was crucial to his um not only his message and the effectiveness of it, but to the inspiration he had on upcoming and future generations. I mean, to receive that many death threats, people
Mhm.
constantly seeking him out to do harm to him, and to still be able to preach a message of nonviolence and calm, and just that presence that he
Mhm.
emanated whenever he walked in a room.
Mhm.
It's honestly, it's marvelous.
That's
I'm
right.
just honest about it.
The tranquility. I love it. And Dr. King, make no mistake, he did come to realize that this is what he had to do. But I'm sure there were times where he was like anybody, because he was human, that he would feel a little squeamish as well about some of the things that he was being subjected to. But he made it look easy. It's like the old proverbial duck swimming across the pond. You just see the duck gliding across the pond, but underneath it's doing like this. And that's kind of, I think, what some of our leaders, I think that's, they look like grace under fire, but absolutely. But Elizabeth, let's hear from you before I have another observation.
Yeah, I just really think that Martin Luther King's like perseverance and not allowing himself to be like bogged down by other people telling him that what he was doing was like too extreme or too extreme for this time period and that people wouldn't understand. And I really think that perseverance is something that our modern day political leaders need to employ as well, because I think that's just like sticking to the right moral code to protect the people who are historically underserved. I think having that in our current political climate would probably be
Mhm.
just something, and I think even as citizens, I think that's something that we can employ in our own lives, is just having that perseverance to stand up for what's right. And I know I'm echoing a lot of the statements that other people have said already, but I just really think that's something that's very important.
Hey, we need amens, so you keep on echoing. That's right. Yeah, we Dr. King, and I'll just say this about when I say about. Wait, can you hear me? Okay. Oh, because everybody went silent. I don't hear you all went. Everybody must have muted. Okay. Dr. King believed in, as you said, Elizabeth, he would persevere regardless of what others thought. I said at the outset, where his own team members sometimes would be in opposition to him. When he came out against the Vietnam War, his team members were a little upset with him. In fact, by the time Martin Luther King died, he was almost persona non grata in a lot of venues, a lot of circles, because he was challenging the status quo and he was attacking the economic engine, and so he was persona non grata. But when he came out against that Vietnam War in 1967, that caused his supporters, his allies, to say, Martin, what are you doing, man? He said, Johnson signed into law the 64 Voting Rights Act, then turned around and got passed and signed into law the Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. And now here you are 2 years later attacking his war. Man, this guy's an ally of ours. You can't do that, Martin. And his stance was, listen, he doesn't get a pass because he did the right thing in those two instances. He was supposed to do the right thing. So when you're a person of integrity, you don't give people passes when it comes down to these issues of justice and fairness. You have a responsibility to continue to beat that drum and to continue to hold people accountable to the best of your ability. And that's why he's regarded as a moral conscience here in America. Even though, as I said, by the end of his life, he was persona non grata in so many circles.
Joe, thank you so much for sharing your insights tonight, and to our student panel. Boy, were they inspirational as well. And I just wanted to say that you sign all your emails, be encouraged.
Be encouraged.
I always love seeing that. But I think I'd add to that, be enlightened. Because
be enlightened.
Tonight, you enlightened all of us. And I think when we think on Monday about Martin Luther King Day, and really every day, why bother?
Why bother?
I think the question is to ask, what can we all do? What kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of community do we want to live in? And what can we all do, people watching this, people on this discussion tonight, to just affect a little change every day to make this a better world? So thank you for inspiring us tonight. Very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And if you're going to put some information up, or let me say something about the Institute very quick. Oh,
well, yeah, that was my next question. I was going to have you talk about the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Institute and tell everybody about that so they know how to learn more.
Thank you. This is very quickly, because I know people it's late into the evening. The night's far spent, but the Martin Luther King Leadership Development Institute was organized back in 2008, 2009. And what we endeavor to do is bring people together to teach them the principles of Dr. King, to teach them some leadership development skills, to teach them how to mobilize in their community to affect change. And we bring them together from all races, religions, orientations, GEDs and PhDs. We have returning citizens who had been incarcerated. We have everybody, anyone from age 19 to 90 is welcome in the Institute, and we come together, and you've got all these difference of diversity of thought coming together in one room to learn these principles. And so if anyone is interested in that experience, we're going to launch another class here in February, the third Friday in February. So we're currently accepting applications for the Institute. There is a registration fee, a tuition fee. We think is affordable. Certainly, if you have an employer who has an interest in your personal development plan, our expectation and hope is that you would appeal to them to allow you to engage in the Institute and allow the employer to cover that tuition expense. But in the event you're not in that situation and you need some assistance, certainly we do offer some scholarship assistance as well. It has been our aim since its inception to never allow the cost of the tuition to keep someone from going through the program. So if you're interested, it's a 6-month program. It only meets twice a month for 6 months, 3 hours each day for twice a month. And then we complete the program. And at the completion of the program, not only you get a certificate, but it's a program you pick up 3 CEUs, continuing education units from Penn State University, who is our educational partner, along with Harrisburg Area Community College. And so I encourage you, if you're interested, to contact me and let us know, and we'll be sure to get you the application so you can get it in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we get ready to fill out the next class.
Joe, we'll put a link to the Institute website in the copy on YouTube.
Okay.
And also send it out to the attendees so they know how to get more information.
Excellent. Appreciate that.
And also, on behalf of Hershey Area All Things Diversity, we'd like to make a donation to the Martin Luther King Leadership Institute that we hope you'll use for a scholarship for someone in need who wants to understand the tenets of Martin Luther King. So, we'll talk about that later.
All right. Appreciate
I did also want to share this quickly. Joe mentioned his, his book. So this is a little bit about his book, and you can learn more about that by reaching out to Joe. So thank you for sharing that. And also, we wanted to remind you that the Hershey Public Library put together some books and readings that you can enjoy. Those are posted in the chat as well. So we hope that everyone takes an opportunity to check that out. Thanks to the library for doing that.
That's right. Excellent. Excellent resource list. That Testament of Hope, that's like my King Bible. I tell you, that's got all his essential speeches and radio appearances in there. And I glean a lot from that book.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I wanted to let you know, if you have not received it already, that the Hershey Company will be sending you a big basket of chocolate goodies.
Oh my! I've already received it, and if I was standing up, you see evidence that I've already received it.
So thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Aomi, Arlene, Mofi, and Elizabeth, having you involved was truly wonderful. You really brought a lot to this event, and we are really appreciative of your participation. So thank you so much. And I did want to mention that our next event will be in March. We'll be talking about ageism. And then we will be in May coming together again to talk about how to support gender diverse youth. So stay tuned for information about those events. You can find links to sign up on our Facebook page and through Eventbrite. And I think that is all.
That's it. Good night, everybody. Thank you.